Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Japanese internment camps were established during World War II after the bombing of Pearl Harbor through the executive order signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt from 1942 to 1945.
People of Japanese ancestry were taken from their homes, sent to an isolated location, and interned there until the war was over.
This is considered one of the most major violations of the U.S. Constitution and American rights in U.S. history.
The roots of anti-Asian fear sparked in the 1850s when mass amounts of Chinese immigrants migrated to the west coast of America during the gold rush.
At first, Chinese labor was needed and welcomed, but by 1870 they were being seen as competitors to the white laborers. This economic grievance fostered a belief that Asians were inferior because Chinese labor was cheap labor, similar to existing American racial prejudices.
This caused a Chinese immigration exclusion bill to be passed in 1882 by the U.S. Congress. This foreshadowed the events that would happen to Japanese Americans.
Shortly after Japanese Americans arrived in the U.S., anti-Japanese movements began arising from existing anti-Asian prejudices.
These movements became widespread around 1905 because of the increasing migration and Japan's victory over Russia, the first time an Asian country defeated a Western nation.
Many other fears were from economic factors along with envy, since many of the Japanese American farmers had become very successful at raising fruits and vegetables in soil that most people had considered infertile.
In response to the perceived threat of Japanese Americans, the government created internment camps to keep Japanese spies from gathering information about America and reporting back to their country. But eventually, all Americans with at least 1/16 of Japanese ancestry were interned.
Numerous homes were searched and raided by the FBI because they wanted to clear out any connections they had with the enemy.
At that point, you're not really worried about the future. And what's the use of worrying? We have no idea if we'll ever be released from this place. So you make the best of what you have and what you can gain for yourself by taking classes and learning, making friends.
However, many of the Japanese Americans interned were originally from the United States and had no previous connection to Japan.
Said I went to war to fight against Hitler and Tojo to prove that didn't make any difference what your race or ancestry was to be an American citizen. I think basically that's what it was all about.
This caused grief among many Japanese families because they had to destroy many items related to Japanese culture along with pictures of family members to prove their innocence. In addition, many Japanese American citizens were brought to police stations for questioning, leaving their families worried and scared.
The debate over internment camps, however, was not one-sided.
The American government thought that imprisoning Japanese Americans was the only way to solve their dilemma.
They set up conversion camps and sent out propaganda to gain support from the doubtful Americans.
Many radio stations and newspapers also voiced their displeasure with people with enemy bloodlines living among them.
Posters and hateful messages were posted on windows and doors of businesses and homes across the West Coast.
The signs would go up, "No Japs allowed, you sons of bitches killed my son at Iwo Jima."
Despite the extreme racism and invasions, families went to the camps without resistance. They wanted to show the American government that they were loyal and that they could cooperate with the government's orders.
However, German and Italian Americans weren't treated similarly due to them looking like white Americans.
When German and Italian Americans arrived in the United States, the U.S. government decided that they didn't pose any danger, even though they were wartime enemies.
This was unlike the action they took against Japanese Americans, simply deeming them dangerous based on their ancestry.
Life in an internment camp was extremely harsh. As Japanese Americans arrived in their hastily built tar barracks, they were faced with poor living conditions and very few supplies.
In that 20 by 25 foot room held my mother, my dad, 2 sisters, my brother, and me.
In addition, the Japanese Americans were restricted to a very strict curfew within the camp.
When it used to get dark, they used to have searchlights because there used to be these watchguard towers, and the searchlights would, come shining. So we used to play games. Being little kids, they used to have a little ditch right by the barbed wire fence, and we used to hide every time that the searchlight came. We used to kind of duck down, so they won't see us. But now that I think about it, I think there was a grown-up that did get shot because of the searchlight.
Several Japanese American children spent most of their childhood behind barbed wire in conversion camps. They were placed in schools that made them more, unquote, American.
However, despite Japanese Americans being interned, the racism didn't stop.
Come on in for the jamboree. And they'd write back and say, no, those are prisoners of war, and that we're not going in there. So they'd write back and say, no, these are Boy Scouts of America. They wear the same uniform you do. They read the same manual you do. But none of them came in.
However, as the debate over internment camps intensified, some people started to realize that Japanese Americans were American citizens just like they were.
In Cody, Wyoming, a group of Boy Scouts made their way to the Heart Mountain internment camp.
There, white and Asian troops alike worked together to pitch tents and tie knots.
Alan Simpson, a white Boy Scout member from Cody, came to the realization of the injustice of internment camps and fought for Japanese American rights later in his life.
Norman Mineta, a survivor of the internment camps, later became a cabinet member under 2 U.S. presidents and fought for equality for Japanese Americans under the Capitol Dome.
In 1998, Norman joined forces with his friend Alan Simpson to pass the Civil Liberties Act, signed by President Ronald Reagan, formally apologizing to Japanese Americans and granting reparations to those who were actually interned in one of the conversion camps.
Today, the debate about Asian American discrimination still continues. Asian Americans continue to receive hate for their ancestry.
A good example of this is the recent events of COVID-19. When coronavirus made its first outbreak throughout the nation, Donald Trump, the president at the time, called it the China virus.
Battle against the invisible enemy, the China virus, which has claimed countless lives in 188 countries.
Many other citizens of America also expressed their displeasure with Chinese people living among them, simply discriminating against them because of their ancestry.
In some states, the situation became very serious as many Chinese citizens, along with other Asians that might be mistaken for being Chinese, couldn't leave their houses because they might get attacked.
These recent events prove that despite the shameful chapter of Japanese internment camps, Asian hate is still around.